As you know, one of the topics that we have been dealing with on None of the Above is the topic of civility, or the converse, a lack of civility in government. And one of the things we always focus on, of course, on this show is trying to find solutions to problems. And we're very excited today to have as our guest Ted Celeste, who has been focused for the past few years on this topic, how to bring more civility to government, how to help with problem solving. And he has actually developed a program called Next Generation that is associated with the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona. Ted comes from one of the most storied families of Ohio politics. His brother was the governor of the state, and Ted himself served as a state representative for 6 years, 3 terms. As I said, he is currently the head of the Next Generation effort, and this is something that he took up after he left the legislature. And we're going to find out today how he helped get involved in this issue and what he's doing to help, again, drive some solutions. So Ted, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for having me on this show. Appreciate the opportunity to share our work with anyone who's willing to listen.
So you were in the legislature for 3 terms, and I noted, or couldn't help but noting, your term in the legislature overlapped with what we're calling the Great Recession.
Yes, indeed.
So I take it was a time of some turmoil in the Ohio legislature.
It was indeed. It was. I was blessed with 3 different types of organization. When I first went in, we had a Democratic governor, Republican House, Republican Senate. Then the next term, I had a Democratic governor, Democratic House, Republican Senate. And then my 3rd term, I had a Republican governor, Republican House, Republican Senate. And I have to say, the interesting dynamic was in that first term, when we had the Democratic governor, Republican House and Senate, probably was most productive time, because we passed the budget unanimously, first time in history.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the topics that we've talked about on past shows is this notion of the particular dynamic of the government at the time between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And as you point out, how either the executive or the legislative may be different parties, or the legislature may be a different party in and of itself. So you found the most productive period was when the executive branch was one party and the legislature was a different party. Is that the scenario?
Yeah, and I hate to say it, because in my 2nd term, we managed. I'm a Democrat. We managed to win the House, and so we had the governor's office in the House, and I ended up chairing a couple committees. But what happened was the Senate then saw themselves as the backstop, and so a lot of issues which we may have tried to move through the House stopped in the Senate and never got passed.
That's exactly the scenario we talked about on one show at the federal level now with immigration reform, where you have a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, and then you have a Republican House. So you had the executive in one branch was the same, and then right now in Congress, it's the Republicans in the House that see themselves as the backstop. I think that's the word you used.
Yeah, and it's an extremely frustrating situation, because as opposed to looking for ways to work across the aisle and find common ground, it just is, we're gonna keep everything from moving.
So, but it's interesting, in Ohio, you had 3 different scenarios in 3 different terms.
Right.
That's fascinating. Is that attributable to any unique set of dynamics, or?
I think that what happened is, you mentioned the deep recession, and our governor, Ted Strickland, was the victim of that, and getting beat very narrowly in the last election, and so that changed the dynamics, and so it's made a big difference. Now that also meant that with that election, redistricting was controlled by the Republicans, and so we probably have another a decade of this one-party system.
It's another one of the topics we've dealt with. So while you were in the legislature then, and you had these 3 different formats, did you have a feeling that there was a developing lack of civility, a lack of discourse, a lack of problem solving? And if so, how was that playing out?
Well, it was really unfortunate. It played out in a couple ways. What would happen is there would be name calling, and it really got nasty, either in committee or on the floor. That was one of the ways that it happened. Another was you would find where the chairman of a committee would not reach out to members of the minority and include them in the process, and that just made it more frustrating for them, feeling like they weren't participating in the process, and it made for an unhealthy situation.
Now, you mentioned you were fortunate enough to become the chairman of a committee. How did you run your committee differently than that?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, I felt that we didn't have all the right ideas, and so I reached out to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I asked my ranking member in both cases, both committees I chaired, Alternative Energy Committee and the Higher Education Subcommittee of Finance. I met with them and said, what are your priorities? What would you like to see happen? If they had ideas for amendments, to bring them up, and it made a difference. We could still accomplish the same goals because we had the majority, but it made a difference I think in the temperament of the committee and the way that things unfolded.
And then when you would encourage them to bring forth amendments, was your committee then receptive to putting the amendments on the bills in some cases?
Sometimes it happened, but and generally what you could do is try to incorporate them in what you're considering, so that they get their ideas included. It may be that it doesn't have their name on the amendment, but at least there's a give and take and their ideas are included.
And if I remember the scenario you were dealing with, there was probably a time when your counterpart in the Senate was from the other party. Did you also reach across chambers to work
Yes.
together on legislation?
We tried while I was the chair. That was when we were in that with the Democratic governor, Democratic House, and the Republican Senate. So I tried to reach across the aisle in that case, but it made it very difficult because the leadership really didn't want to see things move in the Senate at the time, or at least didn't want to see anything that we'd passed in the House.
So you kind of like this deadlock situation, or this
Yes.
the polarization word that
Yes.
creeps into our conversations all the time.
Yep, and one of the things that was extremely frustrating for me is that during that time I'd been working on a bill that I wanted to. I'd been spending a long time with interested parties. It was on dyslexia, and I, of course, felt that was not a partisan issue, and had the person I was working with across the aisle at the time was the minority leader of the House, who had a great interest in this subject. I took it to my leadership. I said, can we introduce this bill at this point? And that was right before the 2010 election. And my leadership in the caucus said, no, we don't want to do that because it will show that the Republicans care. And I said, you got to be nuts. And we went ahead and we introduced it anyway. Well, what happened is 2010 election, we lost the House, and the next term, that minority leader became the Speaker of the House. And he made sure that my bill got a Republican co-sponsor and that would move quickly through the House at that time.
So you learned a very valuable lesson. You reached across the aisle, and then things have a funny way of turning on their heads in politics, but you had made a friend, and then they were receptive to a solution.
Right.
Did the bill make its way to the governor's desk?
It did indeed, and Republican governors signed the bill as well.
That's awesome. I was going to ask you what your successes were. So you had a major bill in Ohio dealing with dyslexia. Terrific.
Right.
I mean, one of my business partners' son is dyslexic, and I've got a working familiarity with that show. Congratulations to you.
Yeah, that was a big one. We worked hard on it, and on both sides of the aisle, had a lot of good advocates. Met a lot of really interesting folks along the way who've had to deal with dyslexia, and appreciate the opportunity to work on that one.
Awesome. So your term in the legislature came to an end. I assume you decided to think of what next steps were, not to bring the word next in here too quickly, So how did you come to think about what you wanted to do? I'm trying to avoid using the word next, but I can't get away from it.
Yeah.
I do avoid wanting to do the next.
Go, next generation. Well, what happened? I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. Let me preface how I ran the first time. Was I'd been involved in 2005, 2006 in a program at our church called Faith in American Politics, and it was a response to the feelings people were having about the way things were going in the national level, and folks believed that the faith community ought to be able to deal with it. So I was part of a group along with someone in our church who happened at that time to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a Republican, and we developed a curriculum called Faith in American Politics, 8-week course, really at community building and communication. And those skills really led me to decide that I wanted to try to run for the House differently. I wanted to do it all positive and see if we could do that. I ran in a district that was presently run by a Republican, and it was probably 55-45 Republican district, but I managed to win and did it without any negative advertising. And that led me into kind of the mode of governing differently as well as trying to work across the aisle. I found myself encountering people who were using the words civility and incivility, and found that I really wanted to work in that area, so set up a couple working groups there, and determined that kind of post my service in the State House that I wanted to work with my colleagues to try to make a difference. So it actually came a little sooner than I would have liked because I got redistricted out of my district. And so I could have served one more term, but instead I began to put together this civility initiative, met with the folks in the University of Arizona who'd set up a program, the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and I proposed, they were doing it for Washington, and I said, you know, frankly, 50% of the people who go to Washington as senators and congressmen come from state houses. So let's get them before they get there and have a good opportunity to show how you can make a difference through civil discourse. That's how it started.
So you approached the National Institute out at the University of Arizona. They received your idea well. And I'm also fascinated and actually glad that you pitched them on a state level solution. Because I agree with you that so much of the focus is only on the national level. People forget, as you said, among other things, the state legislatures are the feeder system, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But not only that, we have 50 different legislators that need to be civil with each other. That's more than just one in Washington, right?
Every state is different too. I mean, you find that the makeup is different. You have some with all a majority all from one party. You have a mixture. You have Nebraska where there's only one house, unicameral session. So it varies state to state. But in every one, we've found people who are very interested in the idea, want to have us come to their state to help put together a program which will hopefully begin to change some of the behavior in local legislatures.
So Ted, I want to talk about your solutions, but I think sometimes before you can talk about a solution, you have to at least identify the problem. So we know that there's a lack of civility. Seems to me you had to have given some thought or worked with people to give some thought of why there was a lack of civility. So did you identify some of these underlying causes, so to speak?
Well, we have, and interestingly enough, that's also part of the process, because what we try to do is we've developed a half-a-day workshop, which really isn't enough, but it's a good start. So it's an introductory workshop. It's called Building Trust Through Civil Discourse. And we ask the group that comes to the workshop, generally it's been 15 to 20 legislators, up to as many as 30. We ask them to define what their goals are, what they'd like to see come of all of this, and basically set up their own follow-up and action steps. So this is a we've got some ideas about how to get there. We also have some ideas about what leads to the incivility, but generally everybody that we approach with these programs already knows those, and they raise them during the course of the discussion.
So when they're doing that, and again, I think lack of trust is probably central to what you're doing here. Again, why do these people come into the process with a lack of trust? What is there about our system where we have so little faith and so little trust to begin with that we actually have to find a way to solve a problem?
Well, there's a couple reasons. What happens in one case is I mentioned the campaigning and elections. You have negative advertising which tears people down, and then they're expected to go in and be positive once they serve. That's a problem. You don't build trust that way. If you're coming up with fabricating information and stretching the truth in advertising to win an office, it changes how you view about what you do once you get there. So that's problematic. Secondly, once you get there, it's become so partisan that your caucuses, as mine did, will tell you need to do what is best for our caucus so that we can win more seats, so that we can take the majority if we're in the minority, or if we're in the majority so we can sustain it, and not to do necessarily the things that really need to get done, find common ground solutions. So it's trying to get there is one thing, but with negative advertising that eliminates the trust. Once you get there, the fact that your leadership is telling you can't trust the other side because they're the enemy, they're the ones who are going to try to defeat you. So it's not healthy from the start.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned with this polarization and these nasty elections, and taking you back to what you talked about before with redistricting, how much do you think of this relates back to the fact that some of these people end up with more or less protected districts?
I think that's a big issue.
So they can cheat, so to speak. They don't have to be civil, so to speak, because it doesn't come back to haunt them at election time. Is that part of what you're seeing?
That's part of it. That they're playing to only a part of the electorate, and it does make a difference, and that's unfortunate. And then of course there's the influence of money and what that does to how people operate. So it's also a mitigating factor. I'd say one of the other things is what with term limits and what with the way some of the ethics laws have developed, there's no real opportunity for good social gathering between the two caucuses, for instance. And so not only do you have the leadership telling you shouldn't be mixing, but there's no opportunities. And in many cases, lobbyists who want to make sure that they're getting the most bang for their buck will focus on the party in power and not necessarily, if you're going to discuss an issue, bring the majority and the minority together to discuss the issue at a dinner or a lunch or something like that.
I'm guilty of that myself. I'm a lobbyist professionally, and back in Illinois, where I do most of my lobbying, everything's Democratic governor,
Right.
Democratic legislature, and there is I don't want to call it a disincentive, but let's work off that word. There's a disincentive
Sure.
to bring Republicans to the table, because at the legislative level,
Right.
it's kind of a non-starter. So as
Right.
a lobbyist, you don't do that a lot.
Right, exactly. So the lobbying system doesn't make for it. There's no pressure from the partisan nature to bring people together, other than you've all come to this same legislative body for a mutual purpose, hopefully, to solve problems facing the state, and you're all human beings and have common backgrounds, and in many cases not so common that you never know about. And so if you can get into social situations, which is one of the kind of outcomes of this, is people say we ought to be having more dinners together, we ought to really be finding opportunities for a Democrat to go to a Republican's district and see more about it, and perhaps even have a town meeting in their district, ways in which there's opportunities to learn more about each other. And that's how you get to trust building.
And I take it in your programs, these are some of the things you talk about when you're meeting with legislators.
Right, exactly.
So let's jump ahead. So you approach the University of Arizona. They have this national program. You convince them to start doing it at the state level. How did you then go about putting your program together, and then talk about how your program works?
We really picked up on some of the information that they'd already been working on with Congress, and some of what I've been working on with my Faith in American Politics program. And it was, we did the first session thanks to a partnership with the Council of State Governments in the Midwest. They had a meeting in Cleveland about 2 years ago, and invited me and said, we know a Republican colleague of yours out in Iowa who's interested in this same thing. Would you like to have a workshop about it? And so that was the first session, and it was at the end of the whole conference. We thought we might get 20 or 30 people there to the session. We ended up with over 75 people there, and it was so well received that the Ohio bunch that was there said, let's have an in-state session just for Ohio. And that was the outgrowth. We then developed a in-state half-day workshop that started in Ohio, went to Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Washington, and Maine, and we now have a number of other states lined up to do it this year.
So when you go to a state, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, some of the states you mentioned, and you have this half-day program. Can you describe a little what you do in that half-day program?
Sure, and part of it is to get them to feel comfortable getting into a mode of real communication and understanding the other person. So trying to get into a compassionate communication, if you will. So there's a little bit of exchanging information about each other, how you got to where you are. We have a really impactful hour that's called Political Journey. And that actually was a piece that came from the Faith in American Politics course. And what we do in that session is describe or ask people to write down the most impactful event in their lives that determined who they are politically today. And write it down on a notepad and post it on a wall in the decade that it happened. And then there's what we call a gallery walk, where everybody walks to see what all the others wrote, get a sense of some common events, get some sense of things that they had no idea a person might have had impactful for them. And then they do some sharing and talking about those events, and realize how everybody's managed to come to where they are at that point in their legislature. It's a pretty powerful event. And then that leads to talking about, okay, well, how do we begin to have these kinds of discussions in the future, and what would we see as a good civil alternative to where we are today? And so they design the process and actually develop action items for follow-up purposes.
And then do you monitor that? Do you actually
We monitor it, and frankly, one of the key things is this is not meant to be something that's a one-shot deal. We try to find champions in each state who this really is important to, who would continue the effort. We also try to find folks outside the legislature who are advocates for this kind of effort, finding common ground, who would be willing to help sustain it and grow it in that state. So as an example, here in Ohio, we've had a number of groups step forward who are interested in it. The Ohio Council of Churches, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, the Ohio Farm Bureau, the Ohio Bar Association, all are kind of there saying, how can we be helpful to sustain it and make sure it moves forward? That's a key part.
And then, so often you put on the news and you hear negative stories. Do you use these meetings and sessions and then these constituents you build to put out good news results? I mean, do you report on the fact that Ted Celeste and someone else did a dyslexia bill? Do you have a way to get that message out?
Yeah, well, one of the things that happened, again, I'll use Ohio, but it also happened in Maine and Washington. It was picked up by the news media, kind of saying, hey, look, here's an alternative to the way things have been happening. So we've probably had 10 major news stories about this process in Ohio, with a editorial of support from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a couple articles here in the Columbus paper. The Akron Beacon Journal had a couple, one in Toledo, and they're all very supportive. And what happens is that legislators are starting to see that civil discourse is good politics. It's smart politics. And so that's part of the incentive building process.
Yeah, and one last question, we're going to start running out of time here. You've mentioned leadership. And I don't know if the average citizen on the street understands how impactful leaders are in the legislative process. And then you have a program for legislators. Are the leaders coming to the table at the same time here? Are they getting the message, or is this more at the retail level, so to speak, of the legislature?
That's a good question. Generally, we've approached the leadership in every state that we've done. And by leadership, it's both of the majority party, so it would be the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, and then the leadership team that they each have, as well as the minority party in each, the House and the Senate. And we basically tell them what we're doing, ask for their support. We've had, in some states, they've actually introduced us to the whole body as before the session, and encouraged people to participate. They've brought us into their caucuses. It depends on the particular state. We've only had one actual speaker that participated briefly in the process. But other than that, none of the leadership were actually involved in the workshop itself.
Well, hopefully one of your goals can be to figure out a way to actually get the leadership stepping up here at the same time. I love your program, Ted, and our program loves solutions, and I think you're on your way to some solutions here, and I love the fact, again, you're doing it at the state level. If any of our viewers want to learn more about your program, maybe think about ways to bring your program to their state legislature or something like that, how do they find you? How do they get in touch with Ted Celeste? What are some next steps for our viewers?
Couple things. Go to our website at nicd.arizona.edu, and the program is called Next Generation. You'll find it on the website. There's a nice video about the program there, and some descriptions, some photos from the workshops, plus an opportunity, should you be a legislator and want to bring it to your state, there's an opportunity to fill it out and do that. You can also call me directly. My cell phone is 614-679-7722. Happy to take your call, and I'm an enthusiastic supporter of this concept, and looking forward to finding as many states as we can that would like to participate.
And Ted, for anyone who wants to drill down to look at your faith in American politics messaging, etc., where would they find that? What happened with our church is we ended up, I think they kind of sold the program to a national group, and I think it can be found on faithinamericanpolitics.com or .org. I'm not sure, but the program is online. If you look up Faith in American Politics, it is online. Well, I think if we could get either civility or faith, or civility and faith in American politics, we could start getting some problems solved. So
there you go.
Thank you so much. It's a treat to have you on the show. Maybe we'll have you back for a rematch.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks for all you do.
All the best.
Thanks.